Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, friends. Welcome to another episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and tonight's episode is all about revelations, delivered by whispers, by books, by strangers, and sometimes by things best left unread.
Sounds like trouble wrapped in twine, Otis, and I like it already. From whispering attics to secluded cabins, tonight's collection takes us down all the back roads Ambrose Ibsen knows best. 5 stories, 1 author, no exits.
We've got 5 chilling tales by the fantastic Ambrose Ibsen. Stories torn from his latest collection, From the Heart, 13 Tales of Terror, available now from Velox Books. If you're a fan of dread with a literary twist, you'll want to stick around. But first, a quick reminder, if you like your horror uncensored, ad-free, and always early, we invite you to join us in the patrons area.
Just $7.99 a month, or even less with a yearly pact with the darkness, and you'll get access to all our episodes early in their fullest form.
Head on over to simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons, or go straight to chillingtalesfordarknights.com. Support indie horror and unlock more screams.
Do your part to keep the shadows whispering.
Now then, let's begin. Our first tale follows a man obsessed with languages, but the one he's about to learn isn't spoken by anything human. When obsession leads him to an old bookstore, he discovers that some tongues were never meant to be understood. This is Polyglot Problem by Ambrose Ibsen, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. We need to go. Ethel's voice rang in my ears as I held the corpse close. Skin, once warm, now grew clammy, and its former ruddiness had given way to a shocking white since death had tightened its grip. The limbs, Wyatt's limbs, were no longer responsive, and the joints were beginning to tighten up as though caked in ice. His heart hadn't stirred in a long while. I'd known it the instant I laid my eyes on him in the gutter. Even so, I cradled him in my arms and racked my brain for some way to turn the tide. We need to go. Leave him be, Henry, continued Ethel. She regarded the two of us, slumbering Wyatt and I, splayed across the filthy cobblestones of the alley with utter disgust. There's nothing you can do for him. We need to go before someone thinks we had something to do with it, she warned. We did have something to do with it. My gaze rose over the cadaver's dead eyes and were briefly locked with hers. The shudder that passed through her bird-like frame did not escape my notice. He took a walk off that rooftop precisely because he trusted in me. He believed in me, Ethel. Since our arrival, I had studiously avoided contact with the pool of red that had gathered on the damp stones and which seeped into the gaps between them. The slick trail, whose fountainhead was the crater in the back of Wyatt's skull. I have to help him. I have to try. Whatever. You do what you want, she snapped. I'm getting out of here. Still, she didn't budge. It was almost as though her curiosity was too great for her to make good on her threat. Ethel didn't believe in me. Unlike Wyatt, she had never seen, heard me work my magic. But she wanted to believe, and the wish kept her rooted to the spot. Cover your ears, I commanded. What? Why? Cover your ears, I repeated. I don't want you to hear this. Not yet. Not until I'm certain I have it right. You're not sure if you can bring him back? You're not sure if you can get it right? Taking a deep breath, I leaned down and began whispering in the dead man's ear. I kept my voice low, delivered each delicate syllable with such stringent enunciation that my throat began to ache. And as the black words left my lips in that alley, I couldn't help remembering. It's said that prior to age 9, children more easily absorb foreign languages. From personal experience, I'd say that's true enough. I grew up in a bilingual household, dividing my conversations between Spanish and English. English and Spanish both had been learnt through something like osmosis, and I've often wondered what it might have been like had I been exposed to other languages during this formative period. It wasn't until my 11th year that I was introduced to my third language. That tongue, German, was mastered within several months of intense study. The next, Portuguese, was attained with still greater speed on account of its linguistic closeness to my beloved Spanish. By the time I entered high school and began seriously studying Japanese, I could have comfortably enjoyed the title of Polyglot. But I didn't stop there. Kanji lessons soon gave way to an interest in Chinese, which I pursued beyond high school and into university. My acquaintance with Arabic began in the spring of my sophomore year, when I befriended a handful of exchange students from Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Before long, I was enjoying meals of kapsa in their homes and getting on like the Shah. I picked up a smattering of French, Italian, and Latin along the way, any of which might have been pursued to the point of total fluency, if not for the thing I encountered early in grad school. Upon completing my undergrad, I was the school's most decorated student in the way of language study, and even most of my professors held me in awe. The ease with which I consumed and mastered new languages was something that most linguists could only dream of, and I was encouraged, with not a little financial aid to sweeten the deal, to pursue a doctorate in applied linguistics so that I might leave a tremendous mark on the field, morphing even Pinker and Chomsky. It was on my path to do precisely that I first met Raúl Esquito, a linguist and polyglot of serious renown. I had sought him out while choosing a new university, and it wasn't long before the boatload of recommendation letters from my old professors earned me a place at his side. I joined him in his researches into the so-called dead languages of the Proto-Indo-European lineage. Professor Esquito was a stern and exacting character, the stereotypical severe academic, but in him I found a spark of true genius. Like me, new languages flowed into him as freely as water, and within a short while of our introduction, I dare say the celebrated professor and I hit it off. Whereas many of the other grad students working beneath him were mere careerists looking for grant money with which to fund researches into their pet theories, Mosquito and I shared a love for language itself, and long were the nights we spent over coffee speaking with one another in more languages than one might hear in an international airport terminal. A few months into my grad school career, I wound up gaining the professor's confidence, and it was then that he shared with me his ultimate aim, a thing he'd been working toward since his own time in grad school. It was his intention to dig deep into the past and to resurrect the languages of the Proto-Indo-European peoples, languages which had not been spoken in many thousands of years, but whose far-reaching boughs entangled almost every modern tongue. To do such a thing was no small task. In fact, though predecessors of ours had long pined to decode such ancient tongues, most had surrendered without having made the least progress toward a meaningful summary. We were seeking to understand languages with no living speakers, and which had arisen at such a time when writing was nigh unheard of. As such, there weren't any ancient texts we could puzzle over. A few experts over the years had referenced certain inscriptions in stone found throughout the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions, but these had never furnished anything like real leads, except perhaps for one. Some years prior, a burial site had been uncovered on the Pontic-Caspian steppe in Moldova by archaeologists. On account of governmental interference and other bureaucratic headaches, their findings were some time in being published. While the discovery of an ancient burial site had initially been met with some excitement, by the time the team's write-ups began turning up in journals, the vast majority of academics had set their sights elsewhere. But not Professor Mosquito. Delving deeply into the details of the dig and corresponding with certain of its leaders over the course of weeks, the professor became aware of certain etchings in clay which had been found there, but which had not been included in the final reports. On account of the region and the suspected age of the ruins, Mosquito believed that this might be a long-awaited physical trace of a Proto-Indo-European language or one of its near descendants. The professor wasn't long in making plans to visit the site. A flight to Moldova for him and his assistants would be costly, however, and at the time the area was still being closely managed by local authorities, which meant endless red tape. But when it came to greasing palms and parting donors from their grant money, none were more skilled than Professor Mosquito, and within a month of back and forth, he'd more or less cemented a plan to visit the dig in person the following spring. As both a cost-saving measure and a bulwark against intrusions by less qualified minds, Mosquito made the decision to travel only with a single assistant. After many months of the fruitful and convivial cooperation already discussed, I was very pleased to be offered that role, and in the spring, prepared to set out on a trip that would change my life forever. Dreams of book deals, of lengthy television interviews, and moneyed professorships at top schools filled my head in the days leading up to our departure. Now, unless one is unduly invested in the goings-on at my alma mater, or else a keen disciple of linguistics, the sudden disappearance of Professor Raoul Mosquito that spring is unlikely to have registered. In my personal circles, though, I can only say that his vanishment led to a tidal wave of attention which was, at least partially, responsible for my exit from academia shortly thereafter. I would go on to give, after that long night, an account of Mosquito's last known movements. Whether questioned by authorities, foreign or domestic, my story never changed. This is not to say, however, that I told the truth. For you see, there were certain things about that trip that I could not tell. There were things about it that would not have been believed, frankly. Somehow, there are times when I don't believe the truth of the whole affair myself, and yet I played an instrumental role in the odd horrors that took place that night on the moonlit steppe. The dig set was quite remote, and at the time of our arrival was manned only by a small handful of semi-local workers whose English was rudimentary. After a long drive via SUV across the steppe, we were welcomed at the edge of a vast pit where excavators had tunneled out large segments of the landscape. This great space, supposed to have been part of an ancient burial ground more than 8,000 years old, was accessible only by ladder. That is, one had to carefully descend one of 3 steel ladders to reach the dusty stone floor below. Having secured access to the site for a number of days, Mosquito and I were assisted by the men on site in lowering our things down to the pit. We'd brought a good deal of food and water, tents, simple bedding, and other necessities in tightly bound packs, and at once began touring the ruins in search of the inscriptions the archaeologists had spoken of. These, it turned out, were in the deepest and least accessible portions of the site. There existed on the eastern fringe something of a burrow lined only with a rickety wooden ladder. To climb down into it was to find oneself far beneath the world in a cavernous chamber some 20 feet in width and length, but with low ceilings. Sure enough, numbers of fragile clay tablets had been heaped there by a long dead hand, bearing the inscrutable markings of a bygone age and tongue. I remember how we marveled at them, how we ran our fingers over the ancient marks with shudders of excitement. I remembered, too, their alienage, for their markings didn't resemble any writing system then known to us, at least not initially. To put the matter bluntly, this deep chamber was all we'd come to see, and after our arrival we scarcely exited it. Hunched and working by lamplight, the two of us carefully arranged the brittle old tablets and began a really thorough survey of them. We took our meals amongst them, slept just outside the hole that led down to them, and subjected them to intense scrutiny. We were not long, perhaps only a day and a half, in drawing parallels between the mystery tongue and newer, more familiar languages. It was Mosquito who had the first eureka moment. By studying the arrangement of the marks and finding patterns in their sequencing, he inferred, correctly, the presence of a sort of primordial punctuation scattered about each tablet. Later, while studying one specimen in particular, I happened upon a set of marks that tugged at the thread of memory, and together we established their kinship to markings in another ancient script, this one already having been translated by some of our contemporaries. With this, we're off to the races. The deciphering of a language by this method is very much a process of trial and error, and without recourse to a native speaker, one can never be completely certain of things like proper pronunciation. Nevertheless, we worked tirelessly from morning till night, connecting certain dots and finding in this forgotten language many hidden similarities to other ancient tongues. By day 4, we were well and truly convinced that we had stumbled upon something far greater than a Proto-Indo-European language. This, we all began to excitedly believe, could be something of a mother tongue to all extant languages. One night, before we had settled into bed, still buzzing with the thrill of discovery, Mosquito put it this way. Think of it, Henry. We may have just discovered the language of the garden. I shared in his enthusiasm at the time, and even now I have no doubts that the tongue we pored over was indeed ancient. I am equally sure, however, that it was not the language of Eden. It was, in fact, something sinister, something that had probably been better off forgotten. The disappearance to which I have alluded took place early one evening, as our work was winding down and the steppe was treated to a light rain. By this time, Professor Mosquito and I had begun working out a fragmented grammar, and had even begun parsing declensions. At every turn, this ancient language was showing signs of life. Our notes were voluminous, and already my mentor had been making plans to entreat both the local authorities and our benefactors out west for more time at the site. He thought our work easily the most important of his career, and theorized that when we were through, our efforts would prove as influential and well-known as the Rosetta Stone. As I've said, the site was maintained by Moldovan men, vetted by the local authorities. These men were given to lengthy lapses in their surveillance. Given that the dig site was so remote, they wagered rightly that it would be of little interest to outsiders, and that its distance from civilization alone was enough to keep it protected. While they should have been keeping a close eye on things and assisting the professor and I, with our doings, the men often stole away to the nearest village to drink away their shifts with dark-haired women, an arrangement which suited Esquido and I just fine, for it saved us the trouble of trying to communicate with them in our admittedly fragmented Romanian. The two of us were quite alone on the site then, when the incident occurred. Seeking after a morsel of food to fuel him after the final leg of our night's researches, he left me in the lower chamber and began ascending the ladder to the main floor where our supplies were stored. He made it only a few rungs up the thing when, with a sickening crunch, the worm-eaten wood gave way and he went crashing back down into the subterranean chamber, where he landed on his head and went immediately still. I answered the commotion with amusement at first, believing that he'd dropped something or merely lost his footing on the crummy old ladder. But as I moved to the mouth of the pit and found him sprawled across the floor, with eyes bulging and mouth agape, I understood that he'd sustained truly traumatic injuries and sought to tend to him at once. Alas, my skill in medicine is not nearly so great as my skill in language, and at any rate, there are few remedies for a broken neck. Professor Esquido died in something of a freak accident that evening, and I now found myself alone with him in the deepest reaches of the dig site. You may well imagine my upset and terror, and I went on to make a terrible racket at the bottom of the pit. I tried to salvage the old ladder to claw my way back up to the surface, but to little effect. Even on the best of days, the thing had never been especially sturdy. What's more, despite the awful cries I threw into the air to the point of utter hoarseness, no one ever came to my aid. Our local handlers had absconded to this or that watering hole, as was their custom, and in doing so had sentenced me to spend the night underground with my dead professor. A few hours passed, and night fell upon me with the hardness of iron. Hunger and thirst might have nipped ceaselessly at my heels, if not for the fright and revulsion I felt at my predicament. Instead, I felt them only intermittently. We had been in the habit of camping within the dig site, some 10 or 15 feet down, and even from there, with the shadows of the settlement's ancient walls upon us, I had found the nights quite dark. In the little chasm that led into the chamber packed with tablets, however, I learned the true meaning of darkness, and if not for my lamp and the professor's, would have thought myself blind. I did what I could with Esquido's body, arranged it carefully, and tried to show some reverence, but when shock and horror gave way to numbness in the smallest hours, I retreated back into the cavern a little ways, toward the lamps, and sought to distract myself. I had nothing much to busy myself with but the work at hand, of course, and so it was that slowly I resumed the effort that Esquido and I had been so absorbed in just hours before. With the late professor's notes and my own close at hand, I continued to pore over the clay tablets, drawing still more parallels between their markings and those of other extinct languages. At first, I did it only to keep myself calm, to give my mind something healthy to fixate on in the face of mortal fright. I admit, however, with no little embarrassment, that I soon became so enchanted with my work that I occasionally forgot that my professor's body lay in repose nearby. The hours fell away, and the creatures on the steps sang their nocturnal songs. I plugged away at my translations with almost maniacal gusto, and from down below my voice joined the nightly chorus. Tenuously, fitfully, I gave voice to words older than any known empire. The tablet that I had made most progress on, and which subsequently most intrigued me, seemed to have something to do with ancient burial rites or care of the dead, a most appropriate topic considering my circumstances. I tugged at every word, filled pages with conjectures about single characters, and got into the habit of fastidiously copying the original texts in my field notebook. As far as I could tell, this particular tablet was kind of religious, right? Having made considerable strides over the preceding days, I tried my hand at phonetics. Line by line, stumbling many times, I fought my way through the tablet's contents aloud. As one can imagine, with each subsequent pass, while liberally referencing both my notes and the professor's, I improved. I imagined myself the newest in a long line of eons dead high priests, pronouncing an unmentionable rite in a shadowed temple surrounded only by flickering candlelight. Again and again I spoke the words, tightening my approach gradually until I was reasonably sure that my delivery was authentic. I had, in this selection, a real triumph, a key which would make the contents of the other tablets intelligible to me, and which would allow me to resurrect the long-dead tongue. The success I'd had would surely go on to fill many gaps in other language families as well, would put to rest many doubts plaguing not only Proto-Indo-European languages, but tongues as disparate as Coptic and Etruscan. Though Esquito was dead, his labors would live on, and he would become, in short order, a household name. So engrossed was I in my labors that I did not at once notice the sudden burst of movement from the other end of the cavern. It was only when I paced slowly toward the exit, my eyes sore for hours of uninterrupted reading by the harsh lamplight, that I discovered my mentor sitting upright on the floor, his back resting against the fragments of the shattered ladder. I had not left him in that position, of that I was sure. Neither had his face been twisted in an infernal smirk when last I'd laid eyes on him, yet there he was, grinning toothily from ear to bluish ear. Professor? I remembered crying out, though nothing in his expression or bearing any longer called Raoul Esquito to mind. The body, the general outline was his, but in that dim hovel I couldn't get away from the feeling that something else dwelt in the space he used to occupy. With another staggered step, the lamp at my side, I discovered that the odd angle of his head, turned harshly leftward to a degree more befitting an owl's, was the result of a clearly fractured neck. The jumble of vertebrae wreckage jutted almost through the skin, and the whole swollen mass palpitated with his every wheezy breath as though on the verge of violent rupture. The professor did not respond. Instead, somehow, he gained his feet. The movement was remarkably, eerily, fluid for one who should have been, at the very least, paralyzed from the neck down. His gaze roamed upward, strained in search of the night sky, and when he found it, Esquito did a thing which I can only recount with a queasy stomach and a shudder that can in no retelling be denied. Hands outstretched, he muttered something to me in a low, distant voice, and in a tongue, I might add, which I did not immediately recognize. From there, grasping at the smooth walls of the vertical passage with his palms and fingers, he scurried, animal-like, up its length, pitting stubborn feet, elbows, whatever was necessary, to facilitate its climb. In what should have been an almost impossible feat, even in perfect health, Esquito fought his way up the burrow and went crawling out into the dig site proper. I heard him pace away from the mouth of the aperture, heard what I thought was the tread of feet upon the nearest steel ladder, and then I heard nothing more. A called out to him for aid despite my fear, but my calls brought no reply. Raoul had freed himself from the underground passage and had subsequently stalked off across the steppe in the dead of night. The professor's whereabouts ever since have been a subject of much conjecture. I, personally, have no idea where he's gone in the years since that fateful night. For a time, I was even less sure how it was that he'd moved in the first place. It wasn't until later, when I had a little space from the incident and an opportunity to think, that I recalled the few words he'd spoken to me prior to making his exit, and I suddenly understood. Mosquito had spoken to me in the tongue of the cavern, the one that we had been working so hard to translate, and subsequent study on my part had convinced me that they were words of thanks. Thanks, that is, for having resurrected him. I realized in the hours after the ghoulish escape that the whole thing had been my doing. By sitting in that dark chasm, repeating the ancient text again and again, I had unwittingly performed the rite of an ancient sect with only the dead man present to hear. Mosquito's dead limbs had stirred in answer to my speech. His heart had begun pumping on account of my fevered recitations. Without realizing it, I had tapped off into a malefic power, the likes of which modern men have only dreamed of. This black, ancient tongue was no more antecedent to contemporary languages. It was a thing possessed of real power over life and death, it seemed to me. I was not rescued from the pit until early the next afternoon. Slumbering in a hovel, I awoke to the curious shouts of our Moldovan hosts and was hastily assisted. With my things in tow, I climbed out of the pit and helped myself to all the food and drink I could stand, struggling all the while to tell them that the professor had gone in the night. It would not be until the first of many official inquiries by regional authorities that I would be really pressed for answers, and to these suited men I gave more or less the same version of events. Late in the night, Professor Mosquito had unexpectedly left the dig site. I tried to follow, but the ladder had been left in ruins after his ascent. I did not know where he'd gone, I insisted, and hadn't the foggiest about his plans. All this was true enough, and intersected parties both in Moldova and stateside could tell plainly that I'd been blindsided by Mosquito's departure. I was cleared, ultimately, of all suspicions, and the professor's vanishment was laterally considered to be related to stress, mental illness, or something similarly banal. Only I knew the truth. Only I knew that the man had been clinically dead for some hours, and that he had been returned to life on account of my infernal babbling in that shadowed hole in the ground. Had I not spoken things that should not have been spoken, the matter might have come to a simpler resolution. It is a wonder that my belongings were not searched more thoroughly, for had they been inspected clinically, the presence of Mosquito's personal jottings and the painstaking copies of the original Claiborne texts on my person might have raised a few eyebrows. Finally, my handwritten reproductions of the tablet inscriptions are now effectively the originals, for in the hours before my rescue, when I realized what was that I'd done through my utterances, I ground the originals into powder so that none might ever reference them. The destruction of these precious and remarkable artifacts would not be mourned, as previously stated. The archaeologists who discovered the site had failed to mention the tablets in their article, making it so that only a handful of men on the planet were aware of their existence. In the event that their destruction did come to light, well, I figured it would be a very simple matter to pin the blame on the site's easygoing Moldovan caretakers, whose lapses into revelry had left the place unprotected from would-be vandals on many occasions. I wish that I could say that my acquaintance with the dead script ended there. In fact, only my affiliation with academia wound to a close after that ill-fated trip. I dropped out of grad school within days of returning to the U.S., and instead turned to a life of independent study. With what little money I'd socked away, along with contribution from friends and family, I cobbled together something of a gap year while trying to decide what to do next. The detailed notes on the black script and the careful reproductions I'd made of the tablets were always close at hand, no matter where I traveled or what I got up to, and more often than not I found myself delving ever deeper into the language. It was no longer my goal to enlighten, however. I no longer cared for Esquito's vision. It completely turned my back on the field of linguistics. Instead, I sought to leverage the evil tongue, to somehow use it as a means of self-enrichment. There is money to be made in necromancy. To raise the dead, to give hope to the hopeless, is to court immense riches. Who might pay a greater price for a dead son than a grieving mother? Would not a devoted widower give anything to see his dear wife again? Through careful study of the forbidden tongue, I plan to sharpen my skill and monetize it. It is true that my resurrection of Professor Esquito had not gone well, but neither had the chorus been planned. I wagered that a greater command of the language, paired with sheer force of will, could result in a more wholesome and lucrative vivification of the dead. Of course, this was a degraded and filthy course. I never had any illusions about the ethics of such a thing. Playing with the dead, conjuring up imitations of the living, it was all a sordid business. Propelled by demonic curiosity and bald want, I threw myself into it nevertheless. 8 months after dropping out of grad school, I moved across the country to a rural area. It was there that I made my first necromantic attempt in earnest and in secret. Volunteering at a small care home dealing with the terminally ill, I kept my ear to the ground and waited for news of passing residents. There were many who had been deposited there by distant and uncaring family, and my pleas to sit with them in their final hours were confused for goodness by all who heard them. Instead, like a vulture awaiting the choicest pickings, I sat at the bedside of a dying octogenarian and listened for his final breath. When the last gasp had passed his shaking lips, my own instantly began to wag with the guttural tones of the pit. None were more astonished than I when Mr. Parker, 87 years old, bedbound and suffering from incurable cancer, suddenly rose up from his bed and attacked his nurses after my shift was through. The local news was briefly swamped by the story, which told of the man's sudden physical vigor, mental collapse, and savage treatment of staff. My little experiment happened to prolong the man's life by a few more months, and resulted in a young nurse getting one of her eyes brutally gouged and her nose broken. Like the last time with Professor Esquito, something had gone wrong. The man returned to life, yes, but he'd come back different. The light had gone from him, and darkness had settled into the open spaces. Why this occurred, why darkness and violence appeared to be the inheritance of all those resurrected by the ancient rite, was a mystery to me, but I was committed to my work. The kinks would be ironed out eventually, I told myself. The next body I experimented on was that of a young woman, a drug addict. I had long since moved on to a big city and had been watching the area's junkies with a certain covetousness. One night, word went round that a pretty young thing had been duped by a fentanyl-laced good, and her corpse presence in the back room of a club was going to make a real headache for the proprietor. A few club-goers gawked in curiosity. A few went on to dial authorities. By the time the ambulance rolled up, however, the girl was long gone, and I with her. With music thudding in the other room, I'd locked the door and knelt beside her cooling corpse, which had been left propped up against a bench. With great care, I leaned in and whispered the words I had long committed to memory into her ears. Every line of dialogue went punching into her eardrum, and it wasn't long before the rest of her body responded to the rhythm. She jerked awake as though she'd been Narcaned. and flew at once from the bench. With a terrible scream, she ripped at her bottle-blonde hair and made for the nearest exit door. I followed at her heels, waiting for the shock of resurrection to cease. It did, seemingly, after 5 or 10 minutes, when we found ourselves hovering alone near a shuttered convenience store and bathed in the neon lights of nearby storefronts. There, twitching and slumped, she turned and fixed me with crystal-clear eyes. "How are you feeling?" I asked, extending a hand. She didn't take it. She didn't move toward me at all, her gaze narrowing. "What's your name?" I chanced. "Eugenie," came the reply in a cold and distant voice. She clutched at herself a little, chest rising and falling, as though she fought to savor a breath. Who are you?" "My name's Henry," I explained, slipping both hands into my pockets so as to put her at ease. "I heard you were in trouble and I wanted to help you." At this, the woman shuddered. Her expression, previously unsteady with dreamy unease, hardened into something animalistic. Her clear eyes became clouded by hatred, and her delicate features were quickly wrenched in service of telegraphing the same. The words that flowed from her lips shortly thereafter cannot be reproduced here, not simply on account of their filthiness and combativeness, but because they were uttered in the black tongue. Cast in brilliant neon and seething with an otherworldly anger, the creature before me bristled with the promise of violence. I confess that I fled before she could make good on her threat, and after a few more nights of constantly looking over my shoulder for the mess of my own creation, I quietly moved on to another city on the opposite coast. Dozens. Over the years, there had been dozens of attempts at resurrection. Each time I had succeeded in bringing the subjects back to life, though it was only life of a kind. I'd never once succeeded in returning a person back to their normal, natural state. Somewhere along the line, somewhere between death and new life, something integral was lost and something infernal moved in. This happened to a greater or lesser degree without exception, and each time my subject would either escape from me and vanish into the wide world, or else I would be forced to run. And now, with Wyatt's body clutched to my bosom, I wondered if this time would be any different, if it could ever be different. After my litany of failures, I decided to seek outside help. The formation of a society, a cult, would allow me to share my work with others and also to refine it through their talents and insights. Wyatt had been among the first members of this bold new group and had seen my abilities firsthand. Ethel, a newcomer, had been drawn in by rumors but very much remained a skeptic. Now, kneeling in the alley, I had a choice to make. Wyatt had wished to help me with my research. "If something were to happen to me, you could bring me back, Henry," he opined. "It'd be cool to experience that." Perish the thought, I said with a chuckle, not knowing at the time what he had planned. "We'll find other bodies, other subjects. I tell you, I'm very close to perfecting this. I'm nearly fluent in the old tongue, and once I've harnessed it correctly, I'll begin passing it on to you and the others." But imagine, Wyatt had pressed on just nights before. What if there was a shortcut? What if, I died and you brought me back? So far, you've only worked on strangers, really. I remember that guy in Des Moines. He wasn't that communicative or friendly, even before he died. But you and me, we're friends. We get along. We understand each other. I could explain to you what it feels like. I could explain to you my impressions and all the things that... No, Wyatt. Let's stick to the plan, shall we? He hadn't obeyed my orders, trusting that he was doing me a tremendous service and that I'd be able to resurrect him intact where I'd failed in dozens of others. It plunged to his death from several stories up. I gazed up at Ethel, clearing my throat. Cover your ears, I commanded. What? She asked, combing a lock of hair from her eyes. Why? Cover your ears, I insisted. I don't want you to hear this, not yet. Not until I'm certain I have it right. You're not sure if you can bring them back? You're not sure if you can get it right? I glanced down at Wyatt's face, strangely serene. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, that my meddling with life and death would leave me damned. By now, the devils were preparing a place for me in the infinite furnace, were tending coals with my name on them. It seemed a crime to disturb Wyatt's sleep. He could enjoy this peace forever, could slumber for eternity, without ever having to know the pain and confusion I had subjected so many other innocents to in my pursuits of knowledge and gain. But as I leaned down and began whispering into his ear, I told myself that this time might be different. This time, maybe, I would get it right. That was The Polyglot Problem by Ambrose Ibsen.
Languages are for the living, Otis. That one felt more like it belonged to a grave.
Or a grimoire. And folks, if you like that tale, it's just one of many from Ibsen's stellar collection, From the Heart, 13 Tales of Terror. Available now on Amazon from Velox Books, and you can find out more about them at their website, veloxbook.com. That's veloxbooks.com, VELOX books.com.
One reviewer called it an absolute gem. Another said it ranges from horrific to sad to disturbing. And they're not wrong. Ibsen's got ambiance and tension down to a science.
Pick up a copy in paperbook for just $16.95 and connect with Ambrose Ibsen at ambroseibsen.com. Trust us, you'll want more. Our second tale tonight drifts into the space between silence and madness, where even breathing feels like a crime. Here to carry us through it is the man who knows all about breathing life into dread.
Thanks, Otis. This next story starts with grief and ends in the dark space where the walls themselves seem to close in. Just don't hold your breath. This is Room to Breathe by Ambrose Ibsen, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. Not being able to afford Christmas gifts for one's children is an awful feeling. Passing a child's birthday with mere well wishes and pats on the back for want of funds is somehow more disappointing for a father than it is for the kid in question. The greatest shame I have ever felt, however, came not from a missed birthday gift or an overdrawn account over the holidays. No, that singular shame is reserved for the occasion when I lacked the funds to bury my boy. For 8.5 months, nearly as long as he gestated in the womb of a mother who would go on to abandon him at a year old, my son fought a terminal illness. We leaned hard on whatever government help we could find, and I missed shifts to accommodate his appointments, straining the patience of a few bosses. It doesn't matter how much money you have, really. 8 months in and out of a hospital will bankrupt the best of us, and I was no exception. There is only so much goodwill in the world, only so much aid that can be summoned with a teary plea. When my son lost his battle against his disease, I was left holding the bill. As a young father with a once healthy boy, perhaps I could be forgiven for not planning his burial with any real thoroughness. For most, who are sufficiently blessed to reserve such terrible sufferings for their twilight years, it would be considered too morbid a thing to put much stock into. Grieving and penniless, however, I now found myself dodging calls from medical debt collectors while trying to figure out how to lay my son to rest. I don't know how other people decide where to bury their loved ones. Perhaps they rely on the recommendations of family members or friends. Maybe the odd print ad or radio jingle makes its case. Maybe, like me, they simply go for a long drive around town with their guts in knots and pull into the first place they find. It was a sorry-looking old cemetery, all told, though I suppose I've never known a really happy-looking sight of that kind. I went swaying out of the car, hands in my pockets, and thumped on the door 30 or 40 minutes before closing. My summons was answered by a bent man of roughly 60 years. His head was fringed in tufts of silvery hair, and he wore a pair of round glasses that drooped along the bridge of his pockmarked nose. He blinked at me a few times and smoothed out the navy turtleneck he wore beneath a tired blazer of similar hue before inquiring after the reason for my visit. "I'm sorry to bother you," I remember saying. "I'm looking for a place to bury my son. I don't have any experience with this, and I don't know where to go." The man, who shortly thereafter introduced himself as Lopez, was very cordial and invited me inside. We together made the trek through a dated lobby and passed into a small back room with space enough for a desk, 2 chairs, their potential sitters, and little else. Lopez was evidently an expert at his trade with many years of experience. I was hardly the first grieving man he'd ever welcomed into his office, and I could tell because he managed me with a paternal gentleness that effortlessly seized upon my vulnerability. I found him talkative and organized, and no sooner were the initial pleasantries left in the rear view did he begin drawing out brochures, speaking of plot sizes, casket thickness, and, of course, money. I listened to the man's spiel, despairing all the while as it dawned on me that I would not be able to afford his most basic package. I asked if a payment plan might be available, knowing full well that my battered finances would never be able to manage even that arrangement, and was sorrowfully informed that, while banks will gladly advance sums with which to procure big-screen televisions, 7-week cruises, and muscle cars, his austere business could only operate with upfront payment. It was then that Lopez asked about my situation, asked me what I could afford. And it was then that the dam broke. Weather enough tragedy in your life and you'll get used to crying in front of strangers. Burning with the fresh ache of loss and doubly sickened by the unfairness of it all, I told the man straight. I was broke. I was on the very cusp and had nowhere to turn. Family members and friends who had once been charitable now eyed me with loathsomeness on account of my endless need. A stint in bankruptcy court was in my near future, but it remained to be seen if even this would keep me from backsliding into utter poverty. The utilities were all overdue, the rent was in arrears, and my job was on its last legs. Lopez listened to this with genuine sympathy, but he was used to sob stories, what with his buttering his bread in the tragedy industry, and experience had made him firm. Unswayed, he set out for me the most basic, affordable arrangements and suggested that he would do everything in his power to make the price easy on me. This said, he hastened to add there was only so much he could do. The economy, that versatile and omnipresent scapegoat, was cited again and again whenever I earnestly pressed him. I was ultimately sent away with a stapled stack of papers with Lopez's neat scrawl upon them, the contents of which detailed the cheapest possible burial arrangements for my son. Before leaving, I threw all shame to the wind. I might have kissed the man's feet for a discount, and I begged him to reconsider on account of my desperation. A payment plan, a simpler arrangement. I even asked him if some other cemetery in the area could do it for cheaper. All this was refused, and sorrowfully, I might add, for I could tell the man was genuinely bothered at turning me away. He apologized repeatedly, wished it could be different. "Would that I could offer you something more affordable, my friend, and I am gravely sorry for your loss. The margins, you understand, are already so thin, however." The margins, I supposed, were thin indeed if charity was allowed to grow cold. And so I shuffled out of that graveyard office a weaker and more hopeless man than I'd entered it, a horror I had scarcely thought possible. That night, I scraped the bottom of the barrel while poring over Lopez's forms and doing pointless arithmetic. It doesn't matter how many times you add it up or pare it down, 0 is all you're left with when you're working with 0. I had one chance of affording a proper burial for my son, I figured, that being the payout of my own paltry life insurance policy. A seatbeltless romp down the freeway at 120, or a long walk off a real tall rooftop would do it. If I conveniently happened to kick the bucket that night, then perhaps old Lopez would be kind enough to take some of that insurance money and make it a package deal, 2 for 1. In the end, I didn't have to resort to such extremity to get the job done, however. Instead, I had only to pass another sleepless, anguished night. On the other end of it, in the wee small hours of the morning, I received a phone call from none other than Lopez. Initially, I'd mistaken the call for an earlier attempt at debt collection, and I almost erased the resultant voicemail without listening to it. Sleepily sampling the recording, however, I found it to be my man at the cemetery. He was reaching out with a most unexpected offer. "Mr. Prescott, I'm sorry to bother you so early in the morning," his message began. "You see, something's come up. I've been thinking about your predicament ever since you left my office yesterday afternoon, and I want, if I can, to do something for your boy. Time is of the essence. Please, come by my office as soon as possible. I cannot stress this enough. There is only a narrow window in which I can assist you with this, and it is a most unorthodox arrangement, I admit. Please, call me back." At hearing that Lopez was willing to work with me, that perhaps this aspect of the nightmare might finally end, I felt the stirrings of hope in my breast. How odd and foreign a feeling it was. Suddenly invigorated, I jumped into my car and sped to the cemetery. Lopez's arrangement was indeed an odd one. In fact, what he suggested was, if not completely illegal, then certainly taboo. I was admitted onto the premises like a fugitive. Lopez had clearly been watching for me. Without a word, he led me through the dark building into the same back room where we'd previously had our unproductive back and forth. There, shutting the door softly behind him, he locked it and went creeping over to a dusty fax machine from which he pulled out a few freshly printed documents. "Something has happened," began the man quietly, shuffling the papers in his thin, shaky hands. "Whatever you decide, Mr. Prescott, not a word of this conversation may leave this office. Am I understood? It is a matter not only of my legal safety, but of my professional reputation. I do not invite you here and make this offer lightly. I do so only out of immense pity for your situation. You impressed upon me that you are a man with little to his name, a man who has lost the only valuable thing he possessed. Let not our earlier dealings make you think me a monster, sir. I am but a man myself, with bills to pay and mouths to feed. Even so, I am not made of stone. Your story resonated with me, and though it is not mine to share, your pain weighs on my heart. And so, sir, when this happened across my desk this night..." Here, Lopez shook the papers in his grasp. "Well, naturally, I thought of you." The man explained his offer therewith and didn't mince words. "I understand that you can't afford a plot, casket, or burial. There is one, however, bound to be buried here this day. An anonymous child, a boy roughly the same age as your late son, will be laid to rest here this very evening. A John Doe, the victim of a monstrous crime. The authorities have gathered all the forensics data they need to continue their case into the lad's murder and have decided now to put him to rest." The local government is fronting the cost for this arrangement. A basic plot has been paid for, along with a simple casket. Because me and my staff are handling this, we get to decide which casket to use and may opt for a larger one. One large enough, perhaps, to house not one, but 2 children. Do you understand me, Mr. Prescott? I offer you this chance at a free burial for your son. He and the poor John Doe may share a grave here, in my cemetery. If you have his body promptly ordered here, I will see to the paperwork and other preparations myself. Your son and this John Doe will be dealt with carefully, laid to rest respectfully, and there shall be no cost to you. Of course, there is a caveat. No one, and I mean no one, must know of what I've done. It would be a matter of some legal gravity and would doubtless cause a scandal. The way I see it is this. Both your son and this poor John Doe have left us before their time. They will be able to keep each other company on the long road to eternity, and you, in your need, will be able to rest knowing that your son's remains have been reverently interred. The old man held his breath and was rather gray in the face. He knew just how outre and ugly his offer was. He'd spun his share of pretty words in making his pitch, but in the end he was proposing that my son play the part of a stowaway in this John Doe's grave. It was a soul-wrenching and stomach-turning proposition. But it was one that I couldn't afford to reject. Having no alternatives, I reticently agreed to Lopez's terms. A call was placed to the local hospital where my son's body was being kept, and Lopez himself made arrangements to have it transferred at once. Within hours, both bodies had been placed in Lopez's care, and the 2 occupants of the full-sized casket were gussied up in short order. My son was laid to rest in his Sunday best, and in cleaning and positioning him, skillful Lopez imparted something of peacefulness to my son as he was placed within the coffin. Then there was the other boy. He looked about the same age as my son, though a good deal more haggard. My boy could not have claimed to have had a nice and privileged upbringing, but this other lad looked, bluntly, like a street urchin. He was covered in bruises, burns, and wounds, some of them hastily sutured by investigators. He remained clothed in filthy rags, barefoot with wild hair, just as he'd been found. Unwilling to let such a thing pass, I urged Lopez to postpone his burial just long enough for me to return home, where I grabbed up a few of my son's articles. The hand-me-downs fit reasonably well, and so John Doe was placed in the casket in a more respectable state. The casket was sealed, and the cemetery staff were not told a thing about who was inside, except that the coffin was bound for the Anon site they'd been in the process of digging since dawn. Lopez and I stood graveside as the thing was lowered and covered with earth, and for that 30-odd minutes I felt myself overcome with a warmth and calm the likes of which I hadn't known in many months. The relief I felt in finally interring my son's remains was immense, and I was extremely grateful to the caretaker for his strange but affordable accommodations. Lopez would hear nothing of thanks. He assured me that my boy and I would be in his prayers and asked for nothing in return save, in the future, good word of mouth. With my son buried and his graveside accessible for the occasional visit, I left the cemetery feeling as though the most painful chapter of my life might finally be closed. I should have known better, of course. In actuality, it had only just opened. The dreams of my son began 3 or 4 nights after his burial. I remember them not only because they were among the first dreams of mine to register in those dreary, misty-eyed days, but because their frightening character served to imprint them in the folds of my brain. If I close my eyes now and silence my thoughts but a little, I can still slip back into that nighted dreamscape. I dreamt my boy was sitting in a black room with his back to me. He twitched uncomfortably in a high-backed chair with velveteen cushions and was apparently aware of my presence. His thin voice reached my ears as he looked straight ahead. Exactly what it was that captured his attention, I couldn't say, but it held him firmly so that he didn't so much as think to turn as he uttered, "Dad, he won't leave me alone." This lone remark troubled me much in my sleep. I wanted to reply to him, to get to the heart of the remark, but in this dream I had no mouth to speak of, no voice, and was reduced simply to the role of concerned listener. "He won't leave me alone," continued my boy, his voice low but intense. "He won't let me sleep." I awoke, a groggy and confused mess in the middle of the night, jarred to wakefulness by the brief snippet of dream imagery. As any sensible man is wont to do during a particularly stressful season in life, I wrote the dream off as a symptom of anxiety, of course. I took no meaning from it, ascribed it no greater importance than I might any other nightmare. I treated it simply as a snapshot of my mental health in the moment, a glimpse into my battered psyche, which was still very wrapped up in thoughts of my late son. But then I dreamt it again some nights later. The same dream, the same scenery, the same plea visited me as I drowsed, though the lattermost had changed since the first go-round. My son's tone was now timorous, his delivery quite shaky, and I sensed in him a childish panic the likes of which I hadn't heard from him since perhaps his toddler years. Dad, please. He won't let me sleep. Dad, he won't. Oh, Dad, please, Dad, help me. He won't be quiet. He won't let me sleep. I came to from this second dream with my alarm fully raised and my son's voice reverberating in my head like a shrill echo. Much time and self-soothing, though, convinced me of the dream's meaninglessness, and when I'd had a good pace around the apartment, a glass of water and a glass of something stronger, I finally laughed to myself and made peace with the fact that I'd entered an era of nightmares. There were worse things in the world to suffer than bad dreams, I told myself, and surely, after all I'd been through in recent months, it was no wonder that my sleep was being interrupted by this less than pleasant fare. The recurring nature of this dream, though, didn't sit too well. I worked its contents over in my mind long after awakening, and there were times when, at once agitated and overtired, I couldn't help taking my son's plea at face value. Perhaps the boy, in some arcane way, had bridged the span between our worlds and was reaching out to me for help. I went back to work, spent my days buried in other people's problems, but returned to the substance of the dream in my downtime. The occasional web searches into supernatural topics brought me no closer to a satisfactory explanation for the dream, though, and a few nights of solid, undisturbed sleep saw it gradually slip from my memory. It's funny, but this slow calm, this slow forgetting, set the stage for the single most terrifying fright of my life. I dreamt the wretched dream a third time. In the first two instances, my descent into the dream space had been measured, paced. I had known myself to be slipping into it before the details had been given even an ounce of sharpness. This time, I fell straight into the black tableau, was dropped into it like a lobster into a pot of boiling water. My son's piercing screams broke through the stillness till I was sure my skull would split in two. And as I watched him tremble and sway in the same chair as before, I thought him white as a sheet. He tugged at his hair, thrashed madly, and even half turned toward me with the widest eyes I'd ever seen on him. He did not ask for help this time, did not address me in any way. He screamed, and he screamed. How long he continued screaming is beyond guessing, but the wonder of dreams is that they can occupy at once a vast space and the space of an instant. All this to say, Though the vision may have only lasted the blink of an eye, I withstood my son's screams for what seemed an eon. I awoke on the floor after that third instance, and in a sweaty nocturnal panic clawed my way across the apartment to my son's old room. Punching open the door, I scampered in, expecting to find him within. The cries I was hearing were all inside my head, though. My ears and skull still rang with them. The room was empty, just as my son had left it before his last hospitalization. I thought myself many things after suffering that particular fright. I thought myself ill, depressed, suicidal, haunted. I marched circuits around my place till dawn with all the lights on and coached myself under my breath. Perhaps I would seek professional help. Perhaps I would call a priest. Perhaps I was coming down with some disease of my own, and this shock of madness was but its first symptom. Eventually, though, I made the decision to call someone else. I chose to call old Lopez, of all people. I appreciated, and in some respects still appreciate, what the man had done for my son, and had found him well-mannered and easy to talk to. My ultimate reason for reaching back out to him, however, was that he had buried my boy along with a stranger. This stranger, this John Doe, seemed to be at the very heart of my son's dream-born pleas. Who else, if not his casket mate, could possibly be responsible for keeping him up, for interrupting his eternal repose? And so, extremely nervous and very careful not to sound the ingrate, I dialed Lopez late in the morning. My reception, though, was not nearly so warm as I had envisioned it. After recapping the trio of dreams and chuckling my way through certain fears and doubts, the old caretaker offered what seemed to me well-rehearsed condolences, but was unwilling to offer anything in the way of practical assistance. To be perfectly truthful, Mr. Prescott, I don't know why you're calling me. I'm very sorry to hear about your troubles, of course, and losing a child, why, who wouldn't have bad dreams? But to even suggest that this has something to do with our unconventional arrangement, well, I tell you, I have known many superstitious men in this line of work, but I am not one of them. You would do better to contact a therapist, I think. But sir, I pressed, don't you think it's strange? These three dreams have built on one another, and my son's cries are— I think, interjected Lopez, that you came to me without a cent to your name, Mr. Prescott. You wanted some room to breathe, and I did what I could for you. I tell you, one good thing about this trade is that my clients never express satisfaction nor dissatisfaction with their stay. So, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Prescott, I have things to do. Take care. Weeks passed, and the dream I have discussed never made a reprise. This is not to say that it no longer dominated my thoughts, however. In its absence, I thought about it more keenly than ever before, and with every passing night of clear and untroubled sleep, the weight upon me grew more burdensome. I felt as though that third and final dream had been an emergency dispatch, and that the lack of further correspondence all but confirmed my worst fears. My son had fallen to some eternal suffering. Due to my inaction, he was now beyond all help. It was easy, too easy, to bury myself in my work. It gave me something to think about, something to obsess over, aside from my son. When I was at work, answering phones or staring at a computer for 12+ hours, I didn't have to think about the dreadful screams, the dream scenery, the unbridled terror in my late son's voice. But then, each night, upon clocking out, I found myself with nothing else to focus on but the dream. Feeling that I had no alternative and no friend in Lopez, I decided that I would go straight to the source. One night, when I was sure there was no watchman working the grounds, I jumped the low fence into the cemetery and visited my son's grave. I had not come with any sort of plan. I'd felt moved to visit the gravesite so as to be closer to my son, though I knew there was precious little I could do to bring him comfort, if comfort, in fact, was what he'd been clamoring for in my dreams. To be near to him, I supposed, was the clearest and fondest gesture I could now muster since we were denizens of two different spheres, and huddled in the cool spring evening, I sat upon the simple grave marker labeled John Doe and stared up at the sky. "I want to help you," I remember uttering into the night. "I wish I could. Just tell me how, my boy, and I'll do it. I'll do anything." The meandering wind brought no reply, nor did the brushing of long grass against the tombstones. I was kept company by crickets and katydids, by the rush of distant traffic and the occasional hooting of hidden owls. But my son's lips remained pursed. I wondered, of course, if I hadn't gone insane. After all, only a madman would go to the trouble of trespassing in a cemetery like this to accost his dead son on account of certain dreams. I racked my brain for ways to ease his burden, stretched out and listened for signs from beyond. Eventually, both physically and mentally fatigued, I fell asleep upon the grave. And that was where Lopez himself would find me the next morning with an almost demonic scowl on his face and a promise to summon the police if I didn't vacate the premises immediately. But unbeknownst to Lopez at that moment, I had not awakened that morning the same man he'd dismissed over the phone some days prior. No, my sleep had been fruitful, and in it I had seen, been shown certain things. With my son's grave marker for a pillow, I saw much. I dreamt that I was walking through the graveyard, its dirt paths clotted with tentacles of writhing mist. Beside me walked a boy, not my son, but a gaunter, shabbier and quieter youth with darker hair. He stood very close to me, but in those rare instances when we touched, I felt only a severe cold upon me, like a wintry gust imposing itself upon early spring. The boy, the John Doe, was looking up at me as we walked, and I admit I met his dead eyes with immeasurable dread. There was something impossibly dark in them, a blackness beyond black, which made the starlit vault of the heavens look bright as day in comparison. He was speaking to me, though his voice only drifted into my hearing at odd turns. I caught snippets of conversation here and there, as one might do by eavesdropping on other diners in a crowded restaurant. I felt the razor go in, but I thought that the belt was so tight there was no way for me to. The smell of cigarettes makes me sick. The burns from them are too painful. Do you know what burning skin smells like? While touring the silent, misty grounds, I watched as the little boy pulled aside his ragged outfit and put his deep wounds on full display. Here, in the core of his abdomen, was a large, ragged hole, an empty thing that puckered and convulsed as if in search of its missing mass. His ruddy torso was covered in little burns, some minor, others made deep by repeated offenses. A ragged gash breathed across the back of his head, and I could see the contents of his skull tenuously seesawing within at every step. And so this was where he hit me with the bottle. The stinging was the worst part of, and I never woke up. One by one, the boy quietly spilled forth his litany of personal horrors. My ears were crowded with the sordid details of his life and the hideous facts of his untimely and brutal death. To hear a boy share such things, to hear one speak so frankly of such profound savagery, ripped at my heart and left me thoroughly gutted. This, then, had been what my son had been subjected to. Since sharing a grave with this unfortunate John Doe, my boy had been forced to listen to this disgusting history of violence night after night. John Doe had died a terrible and painful death and could know no rest. Therefore, neither would he allow his bunkmate the peace of a night's sleep until he'd vented his spleen. I awoke to Lopez's scowling face. He looked on the verge of kicking me and had been muttering curses under his breath for some time before I'd even come to. I remember sitting upright, sore as could be after having spent the night on the cold ground, and meeting him with a sheepish smile, despite all the horrors that had just been relayed to me by the unidentified boy. "You've got a lot of nerve loafing around here like this. I could have you taken in for trespassing, Mr. Prescott. Do you have any idea—" "I don't mean you any harm, Mr. Lopez," I interrupted. "I came here to spend some time with my boy and with John Doe here." The old caretaker regarded me as a lunatic. "What in the world are you driving at? Isn't there some other place for you to be?" I stood, brushing the soil from my person, and stretched. "If it isn't too much trouble, I'd like to come back here again tonight," I said. "I'm afraid that really is too much trouble. You've already overstayed your welcome, and I hasten to add that trespassing laws are no joke. You're liable to be—" "Tell me," said I, "do the authorities frown upon the expenditure of government funds on unauthorized burials?" The old man grew redder in the face than the sun that was breaking out over the horizon. "You dare to threaten me after what I did for you? For your son? No, I refuse to believe that a man could be such an ingrate. You would betray me to the authorities for having shown you kindness, for having accommodated you?" "Of course not," I replied. "That is, so long as you'll let me pass my nights here unmolested." I peered down at the grave marker and then fixed Lopez with a steely stare. "So long as you let me spend time on the grounds with my boy as I like, you can be assured of my silence." Needless to say, I got my way. It was my intention to spend my nights at the graveyard, to lend John Doe my ear each night that my son might rest. And on the off chance that Lopez refused to let me in, I would, with not a little shame, report him to the authorities, which would prompt my son's extrication and, ostensibly, removal to a different grave. Either way, I would see to it that my son would have rest, and that his coffin mate would not keep him up each night with his litany of unbelievable horrors. Tonight, after work, I plan to return to the cemetery. Old Lopez has been good enough to leave the back gate unlocked for me. Once inside, I will make my way to that simple grave marker and wait until sleep overcomes me. And when it does, I will be there to listen to John Doe. Night after night I'll listen until he no longer has need of a sympathetic ear. One day, when he and my son both know rest, perhaps I will come to know it too. That was Room to Breathe by Ambrose Ibsen.
That house had more corners than a maze, and each one whispered, "Don't look."
Next, we journey into memory, where one man recalls a friendship that may have never ended, and may not be entirely human.
Sometimes it's not the people who haunt us, it's the stories they leave behind. This is Joey Santiago Was a Friend of Mine by Ambrose Ibsen, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. The man sweating in my chair was portly and red, an engorged tick of a man, really, but I could tell by the way he was fidgeting and by the desperate ping-ponging of his gaze around the office that he was about to make my wallet pregnant with green. "Mr. Bohannon," he kept on, looking as if he wanted to take another inch off his already stubby nails. I can't stress enough how important this job is to me. The man in question. Here came the pause of one unable to lie on his feet. Well, he's an old friend of mine, and I've had a miserable time getting a hold of him. If you can track him down for me and escort him to the aforementioned address, I would be forever in your debt. Forever's a very long time, I put in gently. Depending on your performance, I may even be willing to pay more than your base rate. Apparently my wallet and I were expecting twins. Call me Salvador, I insisted, hands folded atop the desk. That was 310 Bienville Street, correct? That's the ones, yes. 3rd floor. I know the area. Oh, splendid. When can you start? Mr. Henry Taggart had caught me in my tan suit, freshly pressed, with visions of strong drink and strange women in my head. I'd stepped through a cloud of cologne not seconds before his fat knuckles had sounded against my door, and my undercut was precisely far enough from my last trim to look natural. All this to say, I was looking damn sweet. Too good, maybe, to go schlepping through city clubs and whatnot in search of this man. I hadn't yet ruled out the possibility of a night in, spent kissing my reflection in the mirror. I stole a meaningless glance at my watch and sighed. Business being what it is, I may be able to get started on Monday morning if my existing jobs allow. And what might it cost me to cut to the front of the line? Asked the client, teasing at the checkbook in the breast pocket of his blazer. My Parker ballpoint all but leapt across the desk at him. As it happens, dried ink is my love language. 75% bonus up front, and I'll have him at Bienville Street in time for a nightcap. Taggart must have wanted the guy something fierce, because he wrote me a love letter on one of those checks without blinking. Really can't thank you enough. Oh, don't thank me yet, I warned, funneling the check into my drawer. This fella you're so keen to reconnect with? Tell me some more about him. It's a big city, Mr. Taggart, and I'd like to get right to the heart of things if I can. Well, said the client, his name is Joey Santiago. I hated the way he said his name, Santiago. He's 38, perhaps 39, black hair with a bit of gray. He's been known to chase skirts at the clubs on and around Jean Tunney Avenue. He's tall, maybe a hair past 6 foot, with a long face, rarely shaven. Don't suppose you've got a photo of him? I do not. Pity that. I drummed at my brow with the butt of my pen. Having thrown the details down onto a scratch pad in my neatest hand, I found myself with very little to go on. You got nothing else on this beloved friend of yours? There just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of meat on this bone. How about a phone number? An address? Where's he staying? Who's he run with? Taggart adjusted his spectacles and squared me with a funny look, half sweet, half sour. I'm afraid I don't have that information. It's as I told you, it's been some time since my last meeting with Joey. If that's a problem, however, I suppose I could place this case with another agency. Perish the thought, I said, gaining my feet and giving my waistband a hard tug. If you want blood from a stone, Mr. Taggart, you let me know how many units and I'll bring it to you warm. That's what I like to hear, he cooed, hefting himself out of my chair. It was a chill evening, early in spring. The smell of rain stole in like a thief through shuttered windows, and a molten orange sun was taking its final bow behind curtains of rolling gray. What's he do for a living, this Joey? He married? Any family in the area that you know of? Other associates? Taggart looked to the door as he responded. He plodded across my rug, hand resting on the knob. Shop? Well, he's a factory man, car parts. He might have been married once, though it didn't sound like a particularly harmonious affair. Fair enough, Mr. Taggart. Same simple as hand meets glove. I'll be seeing you again soon. Oh, Henry stole out of the room. I hung back till I was good and sure he'd gone. Then I killed the lamp and shrugged on my coat. I was only an instant in locking up and had come within 3 strides of the stairs when I heard the bawling kid next door and his mother frenzied hushing. The duo were pacing up and down the corridor, the kid's face cherry red, covered with snot. His mother, a real bonny lass from County Kildare, shot me a sorry look. Oh, forgive me, Mr. Bohannon, for all the noise. She's teething, you see. A year or 2 in the States, and the pretty young thing still spoke like she had a mouthful of shamrocks. Something about that accent never failed to charm. Had she been an executioner reading off my list of capital offenses, I might have invented new crimes just to hear her tug on my nose. It's no problem at all, Flossie, I replied, slipping a finger into Junior's curled fist and giving it a little shake. The constant hum of noise came part and parcel with running one's agency out of a boarding house. I was willing to deal with the occasional squealing toddler in exchange for easy access to the city's busiest spots. Now, keep an eye on things for me, lad. Duty calls. It was a filthy place. I don't mean that the glassware was dirty or that the floors were unswept or that the toilets were particularly squalid, though none of the aforementioned were pristine either. I mean that it was the sort of place where you could prop yourself up in a corner to listen to flamenco music long into the night while breathing nothing but the smoke of other people's cigarettes. The kind of place cluttered with whores whose monikers are ludicrous things like cinnamon, velvet, but who answer to names like Daisy Marie back home in Tupelo. The only thing separating one from the wares of these tradeswomen, in most cases, is a whiff of lace and an unchaperoned gaze. And on nights when business was slow, they'd sway along to the music like all the rest of us, sponging drinks off the somber barman and wishing, maybe, that they'd listen to Mom and Pa and never come to the city in the first place. Anyhow, the music wasn't hitting the spot tonight. I knew that old Castro and his boys had it in them, but broken strings and missed chords kept the dance floor clear enough for me to stride into the back room without braving a sea of elbows. I dropped the band a few bills as I went, figuring that I could afford it, and that by tomorrow night they'd turn it all around. The world's cruel enough as it is. Far be it from me to tell Picasso to hit the oil rig after one rough canvas. The big man working the counter and back had a stiff pour ready for me before I even straddled to the stool. "You're looking too sharp for gumshoeing, Sally," he uttered while dabbing at his sweaty brow with a bar towel. "So why do I have the feeling you're about to ask me about some case you're working?" "A sixth sense, maybe. You got a gift, Rudy. You ought to buy yourself a lottery ticket." His dark lips parted in a cheddary smile. "Well, to what do I owe the honor? Business or pleasure? A wise man knows they're one and the same." I lit in a tipple of the stuff, and it chased out the evening chill. "I'm looking for someone, a factory man. I'm told he enjoys chasing skirts hereabouts and that he deals in car parts." "You've just described 100, 200 men easy," came Rudy's retort. "You're gonna have to get a little more specific." "Name's Joey Santiago," I continued. "He's creeping up on 40, or so I'm told. He frequents this area." "Santiago? He may as well be called Smith in a neighborhood like this." The barkeeper chortled. "What do you want him for?" "Someone's paying me a small fortune to track him down. I stand to earn so much off this job that I'll be able to put my kids through college." "Since when have you got kids, Sally?" "Oh, I'm sure there must be at least a few out there by now. Not that I've met them." I siphoned a little more from my glass. "So, how about it, Rudy? Joey Santiago, you know him?" "I know the name," he admitted. "He's a real quiet guy, comes in every couple of nights. About your height. No, a little taller, maybe." So, you're making me feel self-conscious, Rudy. Been a minute since he's come in. Castro's band's playing tonight, and I feel like he's hot on his eldest daughter. He motioned through the doorway and toward the bandstand, from which there drifted an uneasy little number. Were I a betting man, I'd say odds are good he drops in tonight. But you are a betting man, Rudy, I said, slipping him a bill across the counter. Try not to lose it all on the races. Speaking of races, he replied, tucking the tip into his back pocket. If you find yourself at the track this weekend, don't hesitate to bet a little something on my girl Aurora. That horse is going to retire me, Sally. She don't lose. Yeah, I'll bear that in mind, I replied, taking my drink on a stroll. Like a wraith, milling through a foggy graveyard, I navigated the haze of smoke and struck out toward the bandstand where the players had set down their instruments. A few sat for a smoke while others retreated to the bar for refreshment. Approaching the silver-haired virtuoso himself, I held out a hand to shake. Fine playing, Mr. Castro. A pleasure to listen to you boys, as always. The musician was very gracious and perhaps amused that a chatty gringo like myself hadn't noted the faults in their playing that night. Oh, thank you for listening. I wonder, I pressed on before he could join his fellows over a beer, is your eldest daughter here tonight? Inez, he asked. I didn't know his daughter from a Maria or a Alejandra, but rolled with it. Yeah, it's the one, I replied convincingly enough to keep the meter running. Forgive me, but I was hoping you'd grant me a small favor. Would you introduce me to her? I was listening from the back room and was entranced by her playing. Taken by her playing, were you? The guitarist, undoubtedly used to fielding interest in his daughter, rolled his eyes and waved across the room. Oi, Ernest, this gentleman here would like to speak to you about your handclap techniques. The moment Inez Castro sauntered over, I decided I rather liked this Joey Santiago character. Thought him a kindred spirit of sorts. A man with such good taste in woman couldn't be all that bad, I wagered. This nubile thing had never touched a guitar in her life. Rather, the only instruments she had any experience were those mystifying hips of hers, bound up in a sleek black dress. Her hair was blacker than night and longer than it, too. A little impatient, maybe, and tired of being approached by men every hour on the hour, she spared me a thin smile and offered a dainty hand. Yes, how can I help you? Miss Castro, I ventured. I don't want to waste your time. Name's Salvador Bohannon. I'm a fan of this club and of your father's outfit here. Tremendous music. Pace by careful pace, I led her away from the rest of the band. The general hum issuing from the bar ensured that the ensuing would remain between the two of us. Oh, thank you, that's very kind. Watch you guys play up there, I got to wondering something. Oh, and what's that? Asked the woman. What's Joey Santiago think of your music? Excuse me? An innocent question, posed with the intention of taking her temp, revealed that Inez here had no love in her heart for poor Joe. Only hate can invite a foreign species like ugliness to a face as pretty as this one, and I knew right then that the two had a history. Did he put you up to this? She was quick to add while I stood fumbling for my next line. I can see there's no fooling you, I lied. Joey's got it bad, and it ain't good. He's still crazy about you, Inez. I was spinning the yarn faster than I could hold it. I didn't mean to open old wounds there. I know things have been strained. Strained? Echoed the woman. That's an interesting word for it. He's got a lot of nerve, sending some pal of his out here to poke around for him. After what he did. He wishes he could take it all back. I wasn't sure what my guy had done, or if in fact he was in the least bit contrite, but I was in too deep to show my hand now. Can he make it up to you? Not any more than he can make my money reappear, she spat. How is that bum anyway? Still out of a job? Still hustling naive girls to feed his parlays? He's looking to turn a new leaf, I said, though I myself was rapidly losing faith in the fella I was supposed to be defending. How much was it that he swindled you for again, Inez? Me? She laughed curtly. Oh, he only got a few hundred out of me. I wised up quicker than that club girl he was shacking up with. By the time she stormed out on him, he must have stolen over 1,000 from her. Right, the club girl, I continued. Remind me, where was it those two were staying? There's nothing quite like a woman's intuition. Once they find a chink in your hole, well, the whole ship might up and sink. Who did you say you were? Joey Santiago and I go way back, I fibbed. He's an old friend of mine. Oh? Well, a bit of advice for you then. Find yourself some new friends. What, you on his heels now because he scammed you too? I chuckled. Am I really such an open book, miss? Listen. I planted a few bucks in her palm and continued soothingly while her father looked on with arched eyebrows. My time's running out. I just need to speak to him. Whereabouts was he staying with this girl? She had the bills in her hand, rubbed them between her fingers. Last I spoke to him, he was staying at the Morrison Hotel. Morrison Hotel, I repeated, making a mental note. That's grand. Grand. And how long ago was that? A month, give or take, she replied bitterly. The one thing he was good about paying up was room rent. He had it paid out in advance, so I wouldn't be surprised if he was still there. She crossed her thin arms. What do you plan to do when you find him? I left her with a smile as Castro and his boys returned to the stage. We'll share a friendly word, I'm sure. Outside, the sun had well and truly called it quits. I paused beneath the front awning with no company except my lucky strike and took a few contemplative puffs. I'd never paid much attention in Sunday school, but seemed to recall a line in the good book about the lips of babes. Sure enough, that raven-haired babe had spilled the beans about Joey Santiago and had given me cause to doubt Taggart's initial pitch, too. I wasn't walking the streets in search of some old friend or cherished connection. I was looking for nothing less than an out-and-out con man. From the sounds of it, this fellow had his hands in other people's pockets, and it didn't take a lot of imagination to figure that Taggart's were included. Ripping off prostitutes and club girls is one thing, but you gotta be a special brand of stupid to rip off someone with the means to come after you. Taggart hadn't been shy about paying my admittedly exorbitant fee. The guy had money. That could only mean that this Santiago character was in real deep. Finishing my cigarette, I found my way into the back of an idling cab. Morrison Hotel. The light changed and we were off. The Morrison Hotel was getting a bit long in the tooth. Her 8 stories of tired stone looked about as steady on the corner of LeGrand and Booth as the winos shuffling in and out of the nearby viaduct. Busted windows wore plywood bandages, and the lights in her street-facing sign were all out. Scruffy bellhops had their feet up out front. The only baggage they were carrying was the debt they'd racked up during their most recent throw of the dice. No one batted an eye as I cut into the lobby with my head low. There weren't any words of welcome from the fellow behind the desk, and if he noticed me at all, it was with the natural tension of a lazing man who fears himself on the verge of work. The lobby, quad-pillared and done up in bad carpet, opened leftward into a wide hall. You had your bathrooms, stairs, and elevators there, the latter conveniently out of service, along with one thing else. The Morrison Hotel's bar sat at the end of said passage, its doorways leaking smoke. Lights were low, as much a cost-saving measure as it was a means of protecting the kinds of men who hated themselves enough to drink in such a place from greater scrutiny. Stepping through the door, I I found 2 or 3 figures hunched sleepily over mounds of empties, and a barman whose take-home was probably less than his tab. A little jukebox in the corner was spitting out a Jerry Mulligan number, but no one seemed to be listening. I myself walked a slow circuit around the place, making a big to-do about where to park it and drown my sorrows. I chose a table with a wobbly leg near room's center, the one from which I could best discern the faces of neighboring drunks. Started running down the list in search of my man. At 8 o'clock was seated a black man with an overflowing ashtray and eyes so heavy they kept drawing his forehead down against the table. At my 6 was a man in suit and tie, neither of them very sharp, who'd had enough rot gut to kill a pygmy elephant. He was a blonde, though. The figure posed dreamily at my 12, call it 12 and a quarter, was wearing a blue button-down and black slacks. The shirt had been left unbuttoned, as if to give the furry creature on his chest some room to breathe, and his face was dusted in all kinds of stubble. I would have pegged him somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, but a whirlwind romance with hard drink had seen him wash up on the shore of something closer to 50, looks-wise. This, I felt quite sure, was the fabled Joey Santiago. He had the look, I suppose, of one in the habit of playing fast and loose with other people's money. You can't summarize a look of that kind in mere words. Can't point at this, that, or the other to make your case. It was baked into him. An alligator can't hide the fact it's a predator. This fella simply had been born with the cast of a swindler. The time had come for our meet-cute, and I took leave of my table, sauntering over to him. I dropped into my booth across from him and leaned in with my brow knotted in concern. "Joey, are you Joey?" I asked, real sweet and innocent-like. When I saw his eyes open in answer to the name, I knew I had him on the hook and started reeling him in. "If it ain't Joey Santiago, of all people. Man, it's been ages. How you been?" The man lurched in his seat and squared me with a sleepy eye. "Who are you?" he slurred. "Cognac got your tongue?" I teased. "It's me, Johnny from the factory, don't you remember?" Something in the lie I fed him, the common name Johnny, or maybe the bland reference to a factory, proved soothing. He loosed a boozy sigh and nodded in weak comprehension. "Oh, yeah. How long's it been now?" I had to be careful. Taggart had only given me the barest summary of Santiago's work history. I knew he had been in the car parts, but not how long or where. Though the guy was thoroughly soused, one misstep could easily blow my cover. It's been, he hiccuped. It's been months since I left the factory. He fished around in his breast pocket for a pack of smokes, but it was all in vain. "You still hanging at the plant? How's Bill? Still throwing his weight around?" I set him up with a fresh lucky strike. "You know Bill, always been a pain. That ain't ever gonna change." I lit up and leaned pensively on my elbow. "As for me, well, I actually stepped away just a few weeks back." "Did you?" Smoothed out my jacket, teased the rings on my fingers in a crude display. "I sure did. Found something more lucrative. Can't afford a suit like this on factory wage." Sensing that I was moneyed, the guy sat up a little. "Yeah? And what's that?" "These days, I'm a gambler," I replied, letting out a little smoke with each syllable. 3- and 4-leg parlays. Horses, mostly. But I've gotten the system. The returns have been. I let my silence do the talking. Joey Santiago was more than interested. The mere mention of his beloved trade saw him light up like a Christmas tree. "Parlays," he echoed, licking his chops like a hyena. "You know," he continued, "I got some experience in that line myself." "You don't say." I act real surprised. "I never knew you had a taste for risk." What have you been up to since you parted ways with the factory? This and that, he replied, still keenly interested in our earlier topic of conversation. You say you got a system, for bets, that is? You been working alone? No, we put a team together. Real small, but we run a tight game. Our wins have been impressive. I suppose that's why we're never wanting for capital. His eyes widened. You got people investing in your outfit? Few. Our moneyed clients know it's a fickle game, but nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? We've made some rich men rather richer. You wouldn't happen to be looking for a new partner in that little enterprise, would you? He chuckled, and for the first time seemed to give a damn about his appearance. Thinking himself in a job interview now, he coaxed back his greasy salt and pepper hair and tried tugging the wrinkles out of his open shirt. We should team up. I think we could do great things together. This poor schmuck probably didn't have enough cash left in his coffers to cover a cab ride, but that didn't stop him from puffing his chest out like Howard Hughes. To a man with addictive tendencies, a dyed-in-the-wool gambler, there's nothing more thrilling, more attractive than a little more runway. Gambling addicts aren't stupid. They know we've all got to pay the piper sooner or later. The best of them are masters at forbearance. They kick the can down the road at every opportunity. Sometimes, however, rarely, they even win. Matter of fact, we've been looking for a solid man. I ground out my cigarette. My boss has been giving it to me in the ear, telling me how we need someone who knows their stuff. It's short notice, but if you're game, I could introduce you. I'd prefer to work with someone I know. Us factory boys got to stick together, I said. You do that for me? He asked, perking up. He sucked his cig down to the filter and then flicked it across the room. Yeah, let's do it. He rose shakily from his seat, unable to remember what legs were for. He did a little dance between the tables before shaking his heels into the carpet and slowly regaining his balance. Lead the way, Johnny. He threw a thick arm around my shoulder and pulled me close. Can't tell what this means to me. We're heading to the moon, baby. He slurred. Little did he know we were actually headed to 310 Beyondville Street. Joey Santiago spooked like a frightened mare when the building entered into view. On the walk over, he began sobering up. Trudging down the street, heads low, we'd made idle chit-chat, and I'd kept up my facade, copying to a heavy-set wife, a disabled son, and whatever else he associated with the generic factory man he'd mistaken me for. I dodged his question about our destination repeatedly, but once I started across the street with the 4-story building in my sights, I noticed him freeze up. What are we doing here? He asked. This is my place, I lied. We'll head inside, have a couple drinks, and I'll give the boss a call. He'll be thrilled to meet you. Yeah? Something about the spot left him visibly ill at ease, and I felt pretty sure it was all my fault. Something I'd done or said, some loose thread left dangling out of my deceitful doily, was going to unravel this whole thing. With that, I had brought a hip flask. Knowing the guy with a little more drink would have made it easier to guide him inside. Instead, I decided to fill his head with more nonsense. Promises of money, tall tales of unbelievable scores began dribbling from my lips like coins out of a slot machine. We got bets going as we speak. Horses, baseball. Why, I've got a friend in the business who's been cleaning up on dogfighting, if you can believe that. Dogfighting, snapped Joey. That's just barbaric. Cute, I thought. Even my serial swindler here had a soft spot for animals. I led him through the lobby door and started hiking up the stairs, recalling what Taggart had told me. His place was on the 3rd floor. I started to track upward and noticed at every landing that my buddy was going paler and paler. His gaze swept the dusty floors like they hadn't been swept in ages, and he wrung out the handrail like it owed him money. I knew he was beginning to doubt me. My stream of consciousness dialogue was becoming too absurd even for an avaricious drunk to believe. It was one sour note, one wrong word from running back down the stairs and making my evening a whole lot more difficult. We shuffled our way to the 3rd floor, and I zeroed in on the door beyond the landing. He spooked real bad at that and came to a complete halt before we'd even reached it. "Hold on. What building is this, man?" he asked. "This is 310, ain't it? Bienville?" "No," I lied. "This is 614. And maybe you didn't notice, but we passed Bienville and went on to Quincy." He shook his head. "Nah, I don't think so, Johnny. This is 310 Bienville." "If you say so," I replied with a chuckle. "Get a load of this guy," I muttered, "thinking he knows my address better than I do." Joey had a rare moment of clarity as I strove toward the door. "Nah, look, this is the 3rd floor, ain't it?" I lined up another lie and thrust it at him with a toss of the shoulders. "No, I don't know what difference it makes, Joey, but this is the 2nd floor. We've only gone up 2 flights." The guy was mighty close to piecing it all together. He was in debt up to his eyeballs and knew that this was Taggart's place. The one man in town he didn't want to cross paths with. Joey could smell the setup and knew that I was about to deliver him to my paunchy financier. I don't think you really live here, Johnny," he uttered, staring me down from across the landing. I clicked my tongue and approached the door. It was time for a little gambit, a toss of the dice. "Yeah, wise guy? Then why's the door open just as I left it?" I thrust my hand out and took a hold of the knob, not knowing if it would turn. My bluff paid off handsomely, though. The beautiful thing turned and I pushed the door open with a satisfying creak. "Come on, Joey, you've had a little too much to drink. I'll fix you a seltzer or something while we wait for the boss, yeah?" With a gulp, he bought the lie I was selling. Still jittery, he glanced about the landing before joining me in the doorway. "All right, I just could have sworn that..." He shook his head. Never mind. It had been a little ballsy of me to let myself in this way, without knocking. Taggart was almost certainly in, anxiously awaiting my delivery. But I had a thin line to walk. On the one hand, I had to make my presence look natural, to convince Joey that this really was my place. On the other, I needed to give Taggart some cue that we'd arrived. It looked to be a small apartment, sparsely furnished. Coat rack, staggered lamps, a pile of old newspapers sitting in the entryway hall. A few lights had been left on, and a nice pair of leather shoes, the ones I'd seen Taggart in earlier, were sitting nearby. "Honey, I'm home," I announced with a chuckle. I waved Joey on and stood in front of the door as if to hang up my jacket. "Go on, make yourself comfortable," I urged. Joey Santiago wandered a little deeper into the apartment, turned the corner, and then he stopped cold. I couldn't see him from where I stood, but I could feel the scream that came out of him before he even opened his mouth. Someone had been standing around the corner with a club in hand and had brained him. Taggart, or some hired thug, had gotten a jump on Joey, and he was about to get shook down. These and other possibilities jumped out at me before the man himself came bounding back toward the entrance, white as a sheet. He looked straight through me, longing for the door, but when I refused to step out of the way, he threw his shaking hands out as if to drag me. "Why'd you bring me here, Johnny?" he demanded. "Why'd you do this?" "What in the world's gotten into you, pal?" I asked, giving his shoulders a little shake. He wasn't having it. He reared back and prepared to fight his way out. Subsequently, I took no pleasure in cracking him across the jaw. That chin of his was hardly granite. He went down like a gallon of warm milk and hit the wall stammering. Urging him back around the bend with my heel, I cleared my throat. All right, Mr. Taggart, I brought you, man. He doesn't seem inclined to stay long, though. We square? Joey Santiago fell to his knees and looked out across the bare living room, hands trembling against the wooden floors. I looked along with him and found my corpulent client sitting in a high-back chair facing us. His head was hanging low, his chins pressed down into his blazer, and his spectacles were sitting in his lap, one of the lenses clearly busted. Most notable, though, was the entry wound in his left eye. Someone, and within moments, I had a solid guess who, had shot him clean through the head. The wall behind his chair was painted with threads of dry gore. I had a lot of questions just then, and I'm ashamed that the chief among them was, is this guy's check still going to clear? Who put you up to this? Who are you working for? Asked Joey, looking like he might be sick. I didn't have the heart or the words, really, to tell him I'd been working for the stiff. Suddenly, I knew why Santiago had been so jumpy the moment he'd come up to the building. The reason I had to drag him through the door. This wasn't the first time visiting Taggart at the Bienville Street location. All right, Joey, all right. Tell me, what have you to do with this? You owed Taggart a kingly sum, am I right? Look. I had a few bad runs, stammered the man. I couldn't repay him, not as fast as he wanted anyway. I never should have borrowed money from a guy like him, but when he started making threats, I decided I had to be proactive. I had to protect myself. So you came up here earlier this evening and shot him. Dead men can't collect. That's about the length of it. Afterward, you staggered back to the Morrison Hotel to drink away your guilt. He glared at me from down below, his whiskered face quivering. This evening? Brother, I shot this bastard Thursday before last. Come to think of it, poor Taggart did look pretty well established in his chair. That's to say, a dark hue had crept into his skin, his limbs looked stiff as broom handles. He'd been there a while, a week, and change seemed to be about right. And it was my turn to stammer. But what are you driving at, Joey? He was in my office just this evening, hours ago. He paid me to track you down and bring you here, claimed you were an old friend of his. Yes, and you did a marvelous job, Mr. Bohannon, came a low voice from another room. To our immediate right, there was what looked to be a bedroom, its door ajar. The lights were off inside, but we both noticed something, or someone, standing within, shrouded in darkness. The voice was paper-thin, calm. It snuck cat-like through the sliver of open doorway. It was familiar, too. Taggart? I called. That you? A portly, knighted silhouette teased the bedroom doorway before receding back into the darkness. It is, and now I will kindly ask you to take your leave. My old friend and I have much catching up to do. I wasn't sure what to make of all this. Maybe it was a theatrical put-on, meant to spook Joey the swindler. Maybe there'd been a little something extra in that last cigarette of mine, and I was just seeing and hearing things that weren't there. And maybe, just maybe, something was going on in that apartment that I couldn't explain and didn't want any part of. I took another look around, my gaze settling on the dead man across the room. In retrospect, I think I must have been going nuts because I noticed he'd moved a little since my last look at him. He'd turned his head a bit, and his good eye, yellow and bulging, had been fixed on me as if to issue a warning. You got your money. Now get the hell out, Bohannon. I backed up immediately, all too happy to oblige. Well, pleasure doing business with you. Joey grasped my pant leg, wanting to follow me out, but a sudden burst of movement from that bedroom door saw him turn around and whimper like a kicked dog. I didn't stop and wonder what came out of that door, and I sure didn't stick around to watch what ultimately became of the gambler. I let myself out, shut the door behind me, got as far away from Bienville Street as I could. I don't know what happened to Joey Santiago. His name never turned up in the obituary section, and believe me, I looked. It's possible he's still out there, but if he isn't, I'd rather doubt anyone's missing him. Target, on the other hand, showed up in the papers a few days on from that incident at Bienville Street. News of his murder caused a minor sensation, and the authorities did a lot of chest-thumping, promising to track down his killer. And now, to answer this case's weightiest question. Yes, the stiff's check cleared, no problem. Henry Taggart's ghost has been kind enough to backdate it for me. He dated it for the Wednesday before last, the day prior to his murder. That was Joey Santiago Was a Friend of Mine by Ambrose Ibsen.
Ah, childhood memories. They always say never go back. But in that case, it seems Joey never really left, did he?
Not in body, not in mind. Some friendships survive the grave. Others should have stayed buried.
If you enjoyed tonight's journey through haunted hallways, cursed homes, and whispering walls, you're in luck. There's more waiting for you in the patrons area. Extended ad-free episodes featuring bonus tales and exclusive horrors you won't hear anywhere else.
It's just $7.99 a month. Or save big with the yearly plan, and it gives you full access to every story, every scream, but at a single commercial break. You'll be supporting indie horror and making sure the doors to the dark stay open.
To join, just head to simplyscarypodcast.com and click the Patrons tab, or go straight to chillingtalesfordarknights.com to become a member. Come closer to the stories, if you dare.
From all of us here at Chilling Entertainment, thank you for your support.
If tonight's episode proved anything, it's that some places aren't just creepy, they're hungry. A sealed memory that swallows friendships, a time loop that won't release its grip, a childhood home that remembers too much, cabinets that hum when no one's looking, a locked room that might be downloading something far worse than malware. Don't forget to check out more work from tonight's featured author, Ambrose Ibsen. All the stories you heard tonight came from his latest collection, From the Heart, 13 Tales of Terror, available now from Velox Books on Amazon.com. Pick up a copy in paperback for just $16.95 and connect with Ambrose Ibsen at ambroseibsen.com. Trust us, you'll want more.
You can find out more about them at their website, veloxbooks.com. That's VELOX Tonight was a reminder that some thresholds are meant to remain untouched, and some memories stay buried for a reason. But horror doesn't wait for permission. It seeps in through every crack, between walls, beneath floors, and through screens we leave glowing at night.
If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our parent channel, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, on YouTube, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new nightmare.
And if your craving for darkness goes even deeper, swing by my other show, Otis Jiry's Tales from Duskwood, where an entire season's worth of eerie encounter are ready for you to enjoy right now. You'll find it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else you haunt your ears.
We also want to hear from you. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and tell us which story stuck with you tonight, or which one you were too afraid to finish alone.
And let's not forget to thank the extraordinary author who led us into tonight's forbidden places. Without Ambrose Ibsen's imagination, we'd still be safe.
But safe is boring. So, the next time someone dares you to open a sealed door, revisit an old home, or answer a voice that sounds almost familiar.
Remember, some places weren't just abandoned, they were evacuated.
Sleep well, listeners.
If you can.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's OTIS@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?